Well, tomorrow marks 8 years of civil war in Syria, and today we're taking a look at the use of chemical warfare in the country. A study released last month estimates that more than 300 chemical attacks have been launched during the course of the war. The report says 98% of those attacks were carried out by the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. On April 7th, 2018, a major chemical weapons attack took place in the city of Douma, a suburb outside the capital of Damascus. At least 70 people were killed. This followed smaller chlorine gas attacks the month before. The Syrian government denied any involvement. A week later, the U.S., France, and the U.K. carried out a series of joint military strikes against several government sites inside Syria. The Assad government called the airstrikes a violation of international law. Well, Daryl Kimball joins me now from Washington. He's the executive director of the Arms Control Association. Joe, thank you very much for joining us. You know, in 2013, Syria was supposed to have destroyed their chemical weapons stockpile, but there were chemical attacks that still followed. So what do we know about the weapons that they have and their ability to deploy them?
Well, certainly the use of chemical weapons over the course of this horrific war has been one of the most heinous aspects of the conflict. And most of Syria's chemical weapons were, interestingly enough, removed through an international operation that followed one of the worst chemical weapons attacks by the Assad regime, a sarin gas attack on the outskirts of Damascus in 2013. And that led to a joint U.S.-Russian plan to remove 1,300 tons of chemical precursors and equipment from Syria. Syria joined the Chemical Weapons Convention, which prohibits the production, the possession, the use of chemical weapons. And so that removed the threat of major chemical weapons attacks, mainly involving the most dangerous types of chemical weapons like sarin. But what we know now is that there were at least 300 smaller level attacks, mainly involving chlorine and mustard, agents that are much easier to produce. In fact, chlorine is a common industrial chemical. And so since that period, the Assad regime has been using chemical attacks, mainly barrel bomb attacks from helicopters, dropped from helicopters in rebel-held territory on civilians as a terror weapon. And that accounts for the vast majority of these attacks. And then also from time to time, there have been these higher level attacks like the one that Seth just reported about in Douma last year. There was another sarin gas attack in the spring of 2017. So we know that Syria still retains a residual capability to produce small quantities of sarin, a deadly nerve gas, and is still using from time to time chlorine as a terror weapon.
These images just never get old. It's so difficult to see these young children and people being attacked like this. What are the challenges, ultimately, of verifying in a country like Syria that they've actually gotten rid of any sort of weapons?
Well, at this point, it's going to be, it's difficult to make sure that the Assad regime does not, again, use chlorine, which, as I said, a common industrial chemical, as a weapon. The possession of chlorine is not prohibited, but its use as a weapon is prohibited. So I think it is going to be the force of international criticism, the threat of prosecution of the Assad regime, individuals who are involved in these attacks by the International Criminal Court, that may deter Assad from using chemical weapons on a low-level ongoing basis. We do believe that the vast majority of the large-scale chemical weapons production has been eliminated. But ultimately, this problem is not going to go away until and unless the Assad regime goes away and this war ends. And of course, the thing we need to keep in perspective is that the chemical weapons use and the horrible images we see is just really a small part of a much more terrible situation that's taken hundreds of thousands of lives and displaced over 10 million Syrians.
It's a very good point. For all the criticism President Trump has taken from both sides, last year, the joint airstrikes on Syria, many say was really a defining moment in his presidency. Some of his critics even said it really was one of the first moments they felt he was really presidential. It was intended to be a deterrent against future chemical attacks. Was it successful?
Well, ultimately, I don't think it was. On the surface, it looked tough. It was satisfying in that sense, but it did not stop these low-level chemical weapons attacks. And the other thing it did is it pushed the Russians to start being even more difficult in the UN Security Council, which continued and continues to investigate these incidents to try to identify what happened, determine what happened, and identify who was responsible for the attacks. And so the Russians, after that attack, blocked the UN Security Council from renewing the mandate of the United Nations and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons investigators to go into Syria to investigate and report. And that led later to France, the United States, Canada, other countries moving to develop a new mechanism to investigate and to try to hold accountable those responsible. And that was just launched officially by the Director General of the OPCW, as it's called, this week. So that attack, I think, was, had a temporary effect, but in the long run, it has not stopped these low-level chemical weapons terror attacks.
Daryl Kibble, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.